Thank you so much, Vasodarshan. Let's get started. Welcome you all to the fifth session of this series. Thank you so much for consistently attending each and every session. This session is specifically going to be regarding debugging, exception handling, logging, and some of the best practices that we should take care being as a RPA developer. So my name is Nisarg Kadam, and we will start first of all with the best practices of RPA developer. But before we jump into that, have you ever wondered if I'm learning RPA, what exactly I'm looking forward to in future? So what are the hottest RPA jobs right now in market? So as you can see on my screen, senior consultant, solution architect, senior developer. So these are few of the handpicked job titles I have picked to display to you right now. But there are so many job titles which are available where you can explore in the field of RPA. Now, what exactly the role of senior consultant? So being a senior consultant has to look forward to the feasibility of projects and the automation compatibility and check whether this particular technology fits for the automation. At the same level, I'm just telling you high level about each and every job so that we will target what exactly we are going to talk about here. Solution architect looks into the solutionizing of the particular automation use case and designing an architecture around that where we can map multiple people. Now, senior developer is a role who is going to look ahead into a complex sort of technology development where he or she has to have the knowledge about RPA as well as some standard coding language along with RPA in order to map the critical complex logics. Now, being a developer, RPA developer, this is an entry level job where you become a RPA developer or intern, where you get to automate basic automations such as small POCs and small parts of or small pieces of bigger projects of automation. Now, being a project manager, people have to take care about entire life cycle of RPA project as well as manage the project well along with all the resources. Now, lead developer is just a senior position to the senior developer where the person is a lead of all the developers and has to take care of all the deliveries on time and also check whether each and every developer is fulfilling his assigned task on time and also has to manage Scrum on time. Now, the business analyst is a role which has to take care of all the requirement analysis and requirement gathering before project actually kick starts. So before developer starts developing or before developer or solution architect start thinking about the architecture of the project, business analyst is the key role who looks forward to requirement analysis, requirement gathering, creates a process design document, understands the process, which would be very helpful for developers and senior developer to go ahead and to start developing the automation or developing the project. Now, with this, I think you have got a little bit of idea that being a RPA developer, you don't have to directly jump into process and understand yourself and start automating. You will have entire team support such as business analyst, data analyst, your senior developers, lead developers. Now, what is the job of data analyst? So data analyst is more closer to the analysis of the bigger chunks of data. So this is more closely related to your data scientist type of jobs and also related to machine learning engineer. So data analyst looks forward and checks the data part and also how we can re-engineer data to leverage automation. Now, once we have looked into all these job titles, I know you're really excited. So being a RPA developer, are there some of the artifacts which we need to seriously look into? And what are the best developer practices that you should follow? Now, why I'm specifically imposing this as a RPA developer is because this is really specific to RPA developer, not every type of developer, okay? Not every coding developer. Now, when we are working with RPA, we should know that we are working on some tool or some IDE, which is nothing but a framework, which is already written in background with codes. Now, when you're working on a framework, you need to look into all the such things whenever you're creating a perfect project. The first thing which we look into is readability. Now, your workflow should be so good that it should be readable to each and every developer who is going to look after your workflow. Is because majorly in teams, we work with a lot of developers and a lot of testers parallelly, where you will have your colleagues who also will check your solution and your workflow. They might reuse your workflow. So your workflow should be very much readable and understandable. Avoid hard coding. So for avoiding hard coding, we should use configuration or settings file, which you will definitely look at in our last session, which is the 7th session, where we will introduce you to RE framework. Security. So every project will have concern of security, where you need to make sure that all the passwords and credentials that you store should be stored in secure places such as orchestrator credentials or credentials store, or you can store them into assets. Is because security is one of the biggest concern for each and every project. So you need to take care of each and everything wherever there is a security concern. Naming conventions. So you should follow proper naming convention while you're developing your workflow or your use case. And each and every activity should be named with a specific work that you're doing. Now, why naming convention is really important is because in case if you face any error or any issue, the error will throw with the name of the activity where the error has occurred. If the name of the activity is not renamed, you just kept it as type into for both the cases, then you wouldn't be able to understand where exactly you are facing error. Now, why this would be required? We are not thinking about small pieces of automation. We are thinking about automation where it would be a huge chunk of automation where it would be hundreds of activities involved, and you wouldn't be able to map which activity is actually throwing errors. So for that, naming convention is really, really important. Using comments at appropriate places. You should always use comments at appropriate places wherever necessary. Using annotations. So annotations are really necessary even for your activity and for your variables if you're using that variable as a global scope. Now, destruction of temp. So definitely this you might have heard about in the concepts of object-oriented programming, destructor, right? Constructor and destructor. So this is nothing but the similar thing. Destruction of temp is nothing but if you are creating some temporary files, or if you're storing that data for some temporary verification purpose in some Excel file, some CSV file, or some text file, but you don't require that file after the completion of project or after completion of one transaction, you should always delete that file because we don't want to create unnecessary space. So that's why destruction of temp files also, and also temp variables if you're creating any. Code complexity. So you should always think about that your code is not too complex to read or not too complex to understand. So code complexity, even though if your code is really complex, you should map it in such a way that a person who is going through your code for a peer review will understand what exactly you have written and how your logic works. For that, naming convention and annotations are really important. Error logging, which we are going to see, which Anmol will tell you how to handle exceptions and error in some time. So you will go through that, but this is one of the most important thing in every project. Exception handling should be considered. Safe exit. Whenever you are stopping your automation at some point, for example, I have to stop my automation if file is not found, but it should not be an abrupt stop. You should close all the browser which you have opened. You should close all the applications which you have opened, and then you should close and exit out of your automation. So every time when you think about exiting out of automation at any point of time, you need to make sure that the safe exit is being followed and you're following all the proper standards. Avoid image automation. Why I'm telling you this one? I'm not saying that avoid image automation completely. You might come to a phase where image automation is necessary. Otherwise, image automation is only required. In that places, use image automation completely fine. But places where you really don't need image automation and you're using image automation, you should avoid at that places. For example, I'm reading from some of the PDF file. Now, if that PDF is a native PDF, I should avoid using OCR, read PDF with OCR, and I should read PDF with only read PDF text that you have seen in earlier session. Also, you should avoid using image automation wherever there is possibility with some other solution. So mostly avoid image automation is because it gives you less accuracy and it creates a dependency. Now, using storage. So you should always use your storage wisely, is because storage is always given you for let's say, for example, you have a project which is using a specific folder and where you are continuously creating some log files and some temporary data. You don't want to do that. It's because storage is one of the critical part where you should always maintain the storage. You should always look into are you creating any unavoidable data, unwanted data, and are you storing it unnecessarily in some specific folder. So you should always keep forward and delete that on time. Delay management, you should always put delays wherever necessary. It could be implicit delay or explicit delay. Memory management, at the same similar to you are using storages, you should always follow memory management properly. Don't create unnecessary variables, and if you create variable which is not of any use, just delete that on the spot. Don't waste memory of runtime data unnecessarily. And unnecessarily don't pass data from one variable to another variable if it is not needed. Don't create too much of data flow between the variables. Choosing activity. This is really important because choosing activity wisely is really recommended wherever you actually need a specific activity. For example, I just told you, if I have a PDF which is native, I don't need read PDF with OCR. I should use read PDF text. So which activity I should choose is really important. And for that, you should increase your scope of activities. You should practice more. You will tell me, Mr. How am I going to improve that? So the only thing which you can do to improve this is increase your scope. Then comes to the readability. Your code should be readable. So I think this point is repeated here. Now the part of testing, is somebody speaking? Anmol?
Nisarg, I am on mute.
Okay, are you able to hear me?
Yeah,
my voice is audible, right?
Yeah.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, I thought somebody speaking something. Okay.
Yeah, I muted that person.
Cool. So now comes the part of testing. So you should always test your each and every component on the spot whenever you build it. This is really, really important and needed. Comes to the part of documentation. Document each and every workflow that you create, and always create technical specification document of your each project. It is not for the person who is going to run through your automation code, because at the end of the day the bot is going to execute on client machine where there is no code, right? There is no workflow. But documentation is really necessary for a person whenever you are going to hand over that particular project to somebody else for monitoring. That person should know in and out of the project if anything goes wrong. Version controlling is one of the most important thing. Like rest of the automation projects which you do in Visual Studio or Visual Code, version controlling here in UiPath we do in Git, SVN, and TFS. So whichever you think is better and you like. So personally, I recommend using Git, is because I like how the Git manages version control and how easy it is with UiPath to manage version control. Reusability of the code, definitely write your code in such a way that it is reusable. People can reuse it immediately, and you yourself can reuse it multiple times, and avoid huge amount of development time to be spent on this particular thing. Now talking about fallback mechanism. A fallback mechanism means every time, whenever there is something comes as a failure or a business exception, you should always think about what could go wrong. If password is not working, in case you might have entered wrong password, you should immediately put a fallback mechanism to handle that scenario and to make sure that a manual pop-up should pop up and person will be able to enter the password. Otherwise, if your process is unattended, if orchestrator password is not working, then you should automatically pick the credentials from Windows credential store. So you should always have a fallback mechanism to each and every logic that you write. This is really necessary. How to leverage APIs is really also important. You might have seen the previous session which was done wonderfully with Priyanka. So Priyanka has explained you how to use APIs. It avoids your UI handling and UI overhead completely. No tension of selectors. You can simply use APIs, but only when it is available. Saving the screenshots is one of the best practice for each and every developer. Then keeping the logs of each and every email. So email logging is whenever you execute your bot, if it is an unattended robot, you should always email at least yourself that bot has triggered, so that you know at what time bot has triggered with the timestamp, or to your manager or to the respected community, respected team, which you are, reporting to. Using queues, whenever it is necessary that you need a huge amount of data, don't rely on any CSV files, Excel files. Try to avoid that and try to use queues. Is because you have your data stored on orchestrator, and you can look into your data anytime and you can check who has manipulated the data and who has executed this particular transaction. That's why using queue is really one of the most important things, which you will soon come to know in the next session about orchestrator. And finally, I'm talking about configuration, which is nothing but The first part which I told is avoid hard coding. So configuration is nothing but keeping settings file where you store all the things which has to be hard coded, which you can change anytime from out of the code. So you don't need to change your code every time you want to do any changes. So these are all the best practices which I have came across, and with my experience that this should be there in each and every project, should be followed consistently. And if you follow this, you are really a perfect RPA developer. Now coming back to our next topic of the day, which is logging mechanism in UiPath. Now, what are the different types of logs? As you can see on my screen, we have execution start log, execution end log, transaction start, transaction end, error log, debugging log, and we also have user defined log. Now, when you're using RE framework or any framework in UiPath, you can get to know about the transaction start and transaction end, which we will look at in the next session. But what is execution start and execution end log? So let's go ahead and let's look at this thing practically. So I have UiPath Studio open here right now in front of me. What I will do is I will simply drag a sequence. I will rename the sequence as, or I will simply avoid sequence and I will take open browser. Okay, I will drag it here. In this open browser, I will just pass www.google.com, which I need to open in Chrome browser, which I'm selecting from the browser type. I will save it, come back. And now if I execute this process, let's see what happens. So I'm just going to say run. What happened? A Chrome browser got opened, right? It was not expanded, it was not maximized, it was just open as a pop-up. However, if you go ahead and output and if you check, started and ended log has been automatically generated, which you can see on screen. Now, what is this log? This is a trace type of log. Now let's look at the color combination here on the screen. As you can see, this green check and this red check are the testing logs, which tells you whether the test case is passed or test case is failed. This log is a trace type of log, which traces all the data. If you go ahead and debug, which Anmol will walk you through soon, which prints all the tracing log, which you see in a gray color. Blue colored icon is all information. As you can see here, this is a blue colored icon indicated. So this is information log. If you see any orange color logs, this is nothing but warning log. And if you see any red color, that is error. So there are multiple types of logs which we'll just go through. So we just open a browser. Let's try to maximize the browser as well at the same time. Now what happens? Let's say I open a browser. Once I open browser, and if I type just www.google.com, if I navigate to Google, what I want to do is I want to type into, so I will just say simply type into. I want to type into here in this particular text box that temperature of Pune. Okay. I will go ahead and I will check the selector. The selector is saying Q tag input. That's fine. Save it. Okay. And now once I type it, I need to enter. So I will just simply click on this plus button and I will select the enter button right here. Now, if I execute this one, what will happen? Let's go ahead and let's try to look into that. So I will simply say, come back to UiPath and I will simply say run. The browser is open, temperature of Pune, and that's it. So what is output? It ran for 2 seconds. And the browser is open, which is showing the temperature of Pune. Let's capture the temperature of Pune city here. So I will say get full text, which you might have learned in the session of Priyanka and Deepak's. I will indicate on screen. This is the 26 which I want to scrape. I will check the selector. Okay. I will indicate the selector again, 26. Okay. And let's say we go to UI Explorer, where we can actually modify the selector and we select a name 26 as a temperature. I am doing this intentionally is because I need to generate an error. So I will save this one. I will click on OK. And whatever the get full text is, I will simply save it in temp variable. And then I will print it in message box, or we can just show it in log message. Now for showing logs, you have an activity called as log message. So you simply drag this activity here. Now you can actually select the log level. So my log level is information. I want to show information that temperature of Pune is colon plus, and I'm going to print temp. That's it. Now if there is some error in the selector, for that I will simply reduce the implicit time from 30 milliseconds to, let's say, 5 milliseconds by entering 5000 in the property of timeout ms. And once I have scripted the data, what I want to do is I want to close the tab. So I will simply say close tab, close the browser. That's it. Now let's try to run the same workflow and let's try to look what it prints. So let's say run. And that's it. Now, as you can see in the output, what happened to output panel? Okay. So logging execution started, temperature of Pune is 26, and logging execution ended at 3 seconds. So this log which we printed has printed with the message which we wanted to print, and also is in information. Now what if I change the log level? Let's say I change log level to trace, or let's say I change log level to warning. And if I execute the same workflow again, what will happen? Bot will execute, find the temperature, and that's it. And if I go to output panel again, this time the color of the log is different, which is amber color, which is indicating that this is a warning message. Now, where do we need actually error message, you might ask? Now let's do the thing. What we need to do is, this explanation, Anmol will soon give it to you how error handling works, but I will simply show you in one example. So I'm just going to put this into try catch block. If any exception occurs, it will, if any exception is not occurred, then it will run the try block where I'm just going to print log message. And if any exception occurs, I will simply select system.exception and I will print here another log message, which is going to be of an error. And I will just print exception dot message, what exception occurred. Now let's look at how can we create this error. So instead of Pune, this time I will say temperature of, let's say, Mumbai. Definitely it will be different. So let's go back and let's execute this workflow again. This time bot typed in temperature of Mumbai, which is 30 degree, and bot is not able to find 26 on screen. So bot will throw an error and close the browser. Now what happens this time? As bot did not find the try block, did not find this selector, bot went into exception and printed what caused this exception to occur. So we can use log message to print the exception. Now let's go to output and let's check. Cannot find the UI element corresponding to this selector. And this is what the log exception, the exception was thrown, which we caught in the log and we printed. So that is why log messages are really important. We will navigate back to our PPT and we can look at execution start, execution end is auto-generated. Transaction start, transaction end will be there in the RE framework. Otherwise, you can also create this one whenever you are using queue. Error logs are nothing but which I just showed you. Debugging logs are always all the trace type of logs. And the user-defined log is what we have just now seen on screen, which we created with our own custom log. Now, what is the log field? What are the multiple fields in UiPath which indicates this log? So this log is always in a JSON format. Now, if you go ahead and if you just double click on this one, you can see that this is entirely in a JSON format. Now, what all things are there? Let's just go through this quickly so that we can finish with our work. So first thing is displayed, which is message. What is the log message that is there? The second log field, which you can see, is level. What is the level of the log? Is it error? Is it fatal? Is it warning? Is it information or trace? What is the log type? It's a user created log. What is the timestamp? At what timestamp the log was created? What is the process version? It's a 1.0.0, the process version which is not yet published. What is the job ID? So it prints a specific unique job ID. What is the robot name? I have printed the robot name. What is the machine ID? I have given the machine ID. Organization unit ID. This is also there. And finally, the file name, which is nothing but the main. And if I look at the similar thing for logging execution started, this is log type, which is default generated. It is an information level log, and you can see all the rest of the details. So these are all in the JSON format, which you can see. And if you need to check all the logs, then you just need to somewhere click on your workflow and simply say Control plus L, and you will be redirected to the logs folder, which is in the app data local UiPath logs, where you will see all the logs of your studio and your execution. You can simply classify them or sort them with the date modified, and you can get the specific log which you're actually looking at. So that's all about the logging mechanism. And also you can check more deeply in logging mechanism when you actually go ahead and you learn about you learn about orchestrator. So whenever you connect your process with orchestrator and if you execute, similar type of logs which are generated in the local folder will be also generated in the orchestrator. And that is how we manage our robot execution, and we check whether robot is executing correctly and what is the status of the execution for long running processes. I hope you have understood this process. Thank you so much for watching, and I hand it over to Anmol. If I have any questions, I'll pick it from you.
Yeah, Nisar, can you explain the fallback mechanism once?
Okay, so we have a question about fallback mechanism. Okay, so fallback mechanism is nothing but Indra, which is, for example, I'll give you an example which will be better for understanding. Fallback mechanism is something where, let's say, you are typing in credentials for your login module. Now you are fetching the credentials from orchestrator, and somehow orchestrator connectivity is not there, and somehow, let's say, your credentials which are in the orchestrator are expired or old credentials, and those did not work. So bot should not automatically fail and just throw exception that credentials are wrong and come out. You should always have a fallback mechanism. If not this, bot will be there. So if exception is thrown for a specific exception, you can fetch credentials from Windows credentials. Let's say even in Windows credentials, you get the credentials wrong. Then you handle that asking credentials from user. Ask user to enter credentials and show user input dialog and ask him to enter, and make sure that you store those credentials into asset and as well as Windows credentials. So this is how you can go ahead and you can handle fallback mechanism. I have just given you one example, but there are a lot of places where definitely you would like to go ahead and handle fallback mechanism. I hope I'm clear about that. Thank you so much, Indra. So Anmol, you want to take it from here?
Yeah.
Okay, so should I stop sharing? You have the presentation, right?
Yeah, correct.
Thank you.
So I hope my screen is visible. Nisar, is it visible?
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks, Nisar, for such lucid explanation on best practices in logging. And now we'll see the error and the exception handling. And at last, we'll see how to debug. So what are errors and what are exceptions? So errors are events that a particular program cannot normally deal with, or that cannot be caught or cannot be recognized. So those are errors which makes a program does not behave in a normal way it is usually expected to behave. And whereas if I talk about exception, so errors only cause exception. And exception handling is how do we categorize those different types of exception or errors in layman language, and how do we handle it so that, as what Nisarg told, that the best practice is that our program should not abruptly stop somewhere. It has to go with a smooth flow. If there is any error anywhere during the program execution, it shouldn't just stop there and leaving all the applications, all the Excel notepad, whichever the robot was using or the program was using, opened as it is. It should have a smooth end or smooth closing of the program, that it closes everything, closes all the applications, closes all the Excel, notepad, everything which was used in the process. It notifies the team, the concerned team, that there is an exception and this is the reason, and at this particular place the error or exception arise. So proper logging should be there for that. And if you do a proper exception handling, then only you'll have a smooth end or smooth closing of the program, and your team, the support team which has to look into that issue, or whichever team is there who's supposed to look after the issue, they are notified via mail in a detailed with a detailed description, error description, that this is the error message and the source, that from where did the error originate. So explaining all of that. So broadly, there are three types of error: syntax error, runtime error, and logical or programmatical error. So I'll showcase with examples that what are basically these three types of errors. And if I talk about exception, so once we have got the error in our program, now we have to see that how do we handle these errors and make our program bug free, so that whatever is expected out of program, it behaves the same way. So to handle that bug or to handle that error in some way is exception handling. And if I talk about exception handling, so there are some main thing involved in exception handling, which we'll see later. But now, as of now, let's talk about some very common exception which we would face in our daily development thing or in our daily project phase. So the first one is null reference exception. That is when you refer to something which is null or which is empty. So you would get a null reference exception. Then we have index out of range exception. So it usually occurs that suppose you have an array and you have a defined array of size 5 or length 5, that there are 5 elements. Now if you're trying to access the sixth element, so that is index out of range because that index does not exist. We have index till 5, and now you're trying to access any index which is not in the range of 1 to 5. You're trying to access 6, you're trying to access 10, then you would get index out of range exception. Then selector not found exception. So this entire automation majorly plays around selector. And when you're trying to access something using selectors and that selector is not found, then you get selector not found exception. The case which just Nisarg showed, that he did that explicitly, he did that AA name to be 26, so that when we do not get 26 there, there would be an error because the bot would not be able to find that selector or locate that selector. So that is something which he explicitly did to showcase you that how usually error appear. So that is selector not found exception. So you would, whenever you will get this exception, you will get a message that this particular selector has not been found. So that is selector not found exception. Then image operation exception. So when you have to do image automation or you have to take support of an image to do a certain click or to type something, and you're not able to locate that image on the screen, or because in image automation, the resolution also matters. The size of the image also matters. So like when you did the automation, the image size or resolution was something else. And now when you run the process or run your bot, the resolution or the image size is different. And bot would not be able to locate the original image on which automation was done. So then you would get image operation exception. Text not found exception. So there are certain activities which would help you do the text automation, like click text. So if on screen it's written common, some common exception, and I want to click on common. So there is an activity in UiPath Studio, which is click text. So I'll just drag in that activity, and in that activity, I'll pass common. So now the bot would, what would the bot do? It would come on screen and it would search for word common. And if it is found, it would click on that word. But if that particular text is not found anywhere on the screen, then you would get a text not found exception. Application exception. Now, there'll be many a case when you're dealing with some XYZ application during your automation scope. And if there is any wrong thing, or if your application is not up and running, or if it's taking a lot of time to load and your timeout has reached, then you would get an application exception, because what we wanted or what the bot was searching for, if we take that temperature case, that the bot has to get that full text of 26 degrees Celsius written on the browser. What if the internet speed is very slow and it's taking a lot of time to load that particular page? And there is a timeout associated with every activity, which is by default 30 seconds, but you can obviously increase it or decrease it. So the bot would wait for 30 seconds on that page and wait for that 26 degrees Celsius to appear. If post 30 seconds it still doesn't appear, then it would be an application exception, because that particular page on which the bot was trying to find did not load. So that's a sort of application exception. Or if that particular site is down, it's not up and running, then that also would be considered an application exception. Argument exception. So you must have seen in previous sessions that you have these three type of arguments: in, out, and in and out. So which is basically that you're passing something to a workflow, which is in argument. If you're getting something out of that workflow, which is an out argument, and in out is you treat it both the ways, that you are giving something and taking back something. So if you do not pass anything which is expected, that suppose there is a workflow which is expecting an in argument of type string, and you have not passed that argument, so it would get a null instead of that. Null is basically an empty string it would get, and it is trying to perform some operation, or its criteria has not been satisfied, that it was expecting some argument but it did not receive, so that is an argument exception. So these are some common type of exceptions. Now how do we handle these exceptions? So broadly, all these type of exception have a base class, which is system.exception. System.exception is the top-notch class in which all these different type of exception usually exist in. And if I talk about this entire automation thing, you're developing an RPA process or you're automating an RPA process, you would basically deal in with two different type of exception. The one is system.exception, in which all the exception would come under, and the other would be a business rule exception, which is nothing but anything which is related to your business logic or main logic of the program. We'll see that in detail via practical examples. So as of now, if we have got any of the exceptions, what we discussed earlier, or any other exception apart from that also, how do we handle it? If we just leave them as it is without doing any exception handling, that would lead to an abrupt end of our program, which is not our end goal. We want a smooth ending of our program. And for that, we need to have an exception handling in place. So we handle exception by using try catch block. And some key components of try catch block is, the first is try, in which you usually put all your code or all your logic or everything that you have to write to automate something, or everything you have to write for a process. You write everything in try. Then you have a catch block, that if by chance there is exception in any of the activity or in any single line you have written in try, the program would then flow, the control would then come to the catch block, wherein that exception would be catched. Then we have finally. No matter whether exception is there or not, whatever is written in finally block will execute, and hence the name finally, that it has to execute. And then we have throw, that is to throw the exception, like you throw a ball. So the same way you throw an exception to an outer try catch or to an outer container of the program. So you throw the exception. Now let's move towards the practical implementation to see how all this actually works. And then we'll move on to the debugging part. Okay, so first of all, we'll see that how does this try catch thing actually works. So we have a try block in which we actually write in all the code and all the code and logic we write in try block. Then we have catch block. wherein we actually catch the exception. Now, suppose if I have written 10 line of code here in try block, and there is an exception in the third line. So from that third line, the control will then come to catch block. It would not execute the remaining 7 line, but from the third line, if there is exception in the third line, from there only the control would come to catch block. And then we have finally, in which we can write anything we want to write, which has to be executed no matter whether the exception is there or not. So suppose we are doing something, there is an exception, we came to catch block, we killed all the process, we closed all the application, we informed the team that there is an exception, and we have stopped the processing. And then finally, we have to even notify our clients, or we have to notify our team that now the process has stopped. So the process will stop no matter there is exception or not. So that thing can be handled in finally, that here we have written a code of sending a mail to support team that the process has stopped. So that is how you decide that what piece of code has to be written in try, what piece of code has to be taken care in catch, and what piece of code has to be written in finally block. Okay. Suppose I drag in a right line, and here I write try block. Then I write cint dot toString. Okay. And I feel like there could be an error in this right line, and I don't want the program to abrupt or to just close suddenly. I want it to be taken care of so that there is a smooth ending of the program. Now, if I just simply run this thing, what would I get? So I got a runtime execution error pop-up and my program has stopped. Now this is what we called as an abrupt end, that I've just got that there's an error and the program stops. And the exception type, you can see it is system.invalid cast exception, which is also one of the types of exception. So there are n number of types of exception. I've just told you few common types, and all these types fall under system.exception class. Okay. Now I want to put this in try-catch so that I do not get this pop-up on my face saying that your program is not working. I want it to smoothly end. What I'll do is, one thing is that I drag in a try-catch block from here. So you see here a try-catch block. The other thing what I can do is, if I just right-click on this thing, I'll get an option here, surround with try-catch. Or you have a shortcut for that also, that I do Control plus T. I select this particular right line and I do Control plus T. So I would get a try-catch surrounded. So now I have this particular right line in a try thing. Now I know that this particular right line is going to throw an exception and I have to catch it. So I'll move to the catch block. So from here, you can select n number of exception type. We have argument exception, we have null reference, we have input output exception, invalid operation exception. And if you go to browse for types, you will get n number of more exceptions. But as I told, the base class is system.exception. Usually when you'll be doing a real-time project, you would not be aware that what type of exception you would actually get, because, excuse me, yeah, sorry. So we have this exception now. And usually when we are developing, so according to us, we are writing everything correctly. So we are not really aware that what actually might happen. So it's mandatory and it's always suggested that you have a system.exception class so that if there is any exception which is not categorized specially falls under this. Now if I do only system.exception and I'll drag in a write line here, or I can drag in a message box, and herein I'll tell that there is an error in code. And what is the error? So I'll do exception dot. So you get n number of options here, out of which you have this exception dot message, which would give a detailed message about your exception. And along with that, I also want to have the source from where this exception originated. So for that, I'm going to do that. This is the error and it originated at exception dot source. And because of this, so that we are really aware that where our program went wrong, it is a best practice that you rename all these activities. So if I rename it here, write a or convert a to string, or let me do this thing. First, let us keep it this way. So now we are here in catch, and from here we'll send a mail to our support team that this is the error, and from this is the source from where it originated. And now here I'm going to write line, or I can send in a mail from here that process stopped, and I'm going to run this thing. Let's open the output pane to see the. So you can see here execution started. Then we have an error. Error in code, conversion from string A to type integer is not valid. And we got at Microsoft.Visual Basic. Okay. And this is not our source. If we get this thing, we will never be able to, identify that from where actually the error originated. And now here we are in the finally block, which says process stopped. Now there are two things. If we want to stop this, usually your real-time project would not be this simple that you can put everything in try catch. You'll need to have to pass it to the outer container. So suppose this is a workflow and it has been called from a main workflow. So you would need to pass this exception to the main workflow. Now, if I just call this thing in the main workflow, or let me call it here. So I have this try catch thing. I'll drag it. So I've called it here. So I'll suppose that this debug workflow is my main workflow, from where I'll call 10 different workflows and everyone will return their answers here. And from here, I'm going to end my process. Now, if there is an error here in this try catch thing, so what are we actually doing here? If we are not throwing or rethrowing the error, then we are consuming the exception here. So this exception or this main workflow would never be aware that there is exception in trycatch.xaml. If I even surround this thing with trycatch and I have a system.exception here, I'll have a message box here and I'll say exception.message. Okay, so now I have all this, and from here I've called this try catch thing. If I do not throw my exception from here, my exception, which is that this particular thing cannot be casted, would be consumed here. My outer workflow would never be aware that there was an exception, which should not be the case. If you're consuming your exception in your inner workflow, that means that exception is lost somewhere and you would never be aware that your program has worked not in an incorrect way. Now if I just run this, or I'll debug this thing so that you can see. So what is this debug workflow going to do? It will call the trycatch.xaml. I'll do step over. It is calling the trycatch thing, and we know that this trycatch.xaml has an exception. But what is actually going to happen? That when it has called this trycatch thing, it is not aware that there is any exception. So we would never get to have this message box. We would never see this message box because according to this debug.xaml, there is no exception in the inner workflow. So the practice is that you must throw your exception from your inner workflow to the outermost workflow. It's like whatever you do, your parents should know. So if you are hiding it, then they would never get to know. So it's the same thing. The main workflow should know that the inner workflow had an exception. So now I am doing this right line, and along with that, even if I throw this exception, then this debug workflow would know that this try catch workflow had an exception. And I am right line. I'm using right line or I'm logging the exception. It's usually what is that we log the exception in the catch workflow. But what if I first throw it and then log it? Will this thing would ever be logged? No, this would never be logged because as you throw, anything which is underneath the throw would never be executed. From here only your control will go. So this right line would never be executed. So I'll have to drag it down. And from here I'm going to throw. So how do we throw the exception? We create an exception object. And how do we create an exception object? We create it this way. We write new. So that is how you create any object in any language. You write new, that is you allocate a memory to that object. And then you write new exception. And then in round brackets and in double quotes, you write your message or your exception message. So I'll say that exception message is plus exception dot message. Now if I want to throw that this is not a normal exception, this is a business exception. So instead of creating an object of type exception, I will create an object of type business exception, which has to be created this way, that new business rule exception. Okay, so that's how you actually do or differentiate or categorize your exception into different types. So now if I throw my exception from here, this main workflow would then catch the exception. And here it is okay that you consume your exception. Now, because here also if you throw it, then again your program would have an abrupt end. Because there is no another main workflow, parent workflow of this debug to catch it. So in the outermost workflow, you must always consume the exception and do whatever is required, sending the mail, closing all the applications and all these things. And from all inner workflow, you must simply throw or rethrow the exception. Now, what is the difference between throw and rethrow? So if you rethrow the exception, then you don't get to write that new exception thing. So if I just drag in, you see there is no property or no argument wherein you have to type that new exception or this has been created. You need not to. So what is rethrow would just do that it would reproduce the exception which occurred, throws an exception previously caught in an exception handling block. So here I got an exception and I can even rethrow. So if I rethrow, so this particular, when it is in catch block, it knows that there is an exception. It would just catch in that exception and throw it from here, whatever exception is there. If I want to explicitly add something to my exception message, that I want to add that exception message at try catch block, when it was doing blah blah thing, when it was extracting this thing, when it was scraping this data, that message occur. So then I can add an explicit message, and if I have to add that, I have to use throw, because in rethrow you do not get any argument wherein you can specify any message. Whatever exception has been caught here would be rethrowed to the main workflow. So now if I just execute this thing, now my debug workflow would be aware that there was an exception in the try catch block. I'll again debug so that we are very clear with the flow. And we are now going to try catch.xaml. We are here, and from here we will throw an exception. So as of now we are debugging, so you see this blue line. But whenever we have an exception, this blue line changes to red. So if I just press step over, this whole thing would be executed, and I got this red line because there is an error. And we can see this message, exception message at try catch, and then our message. So this exception message at try catch is what I explicitly added, so that my exception message is very clear to my support team, or is very clear to the concerned team, whoever would be looking into this issue. So I added this message, and we saw this red line. Now this debugging panel offers a lot of, you could say, options to us. I can just simply ignore this exception, and this exception would be just gone. My main workflow would never get to know about this exception. Or I can just keep on continuing that whatever is the flow, keep on executing it. So I'll do that. Let's just continue it. So it has thrown the exception to the main workflow. So you can see this try catch thing, now this entire thing is into red. Now if I press continue, the outer container is now in red, and now it would come out of that thing. Now where is this message box? This message box is here in the catch of my main workflow. So this error came to the main workflow, and it went to the catch block of the main workflow, and here I can see the message box. Now I'll press OK, and now my program has stopped. So this is how actually you do exception handling. Now what if I want to categorize my exception into different types? I want to do this thing that if it is a system exception, then it displays a message box with the exception message. If it is a business exception, then it should not display anything and should display that, okay, everything has been successfully executed. So what if I have to categorize? So I can add n number of catch blocks here. So there can be a try. So there can be one try block. There can be multiple try block as well. And there can be n number of catch blocks. So catch 1, catch block 2, catch block 3. Finally, you can have a finally, or you cannot have a finally, you can skip it. But as of now here, you would always get a finally. But as per the logic, you can even skip the finally thing if you do not want to have. Now, if I want to categorize it, I want to categorize it into different type of exceptions. Say I want to categorize it into business exception. I want to categorize it into system exception, and I want to categorize it into index out of range exception. So these are the three type of exceptions I want my 3 catch to belong to, and they have to perform different things in case of these 3 different type of exception. So now the catch here, or the main thing that you have to take care of, is that your first catch could be anything. It could be a business exception, it could be an index out of range exception. Then similarly, your second could be the remaining out of these two. But your third should always be the base class. And why am I saying this? If I keep my base class, which is system exception, to be the first catch. So I have my first catch having system.exception. I have my second catch having business exception. And I have my third catch having index out of range exception. Now, because we know that all these exceptions fall into system.exception, they are just children of system.exception. So if there is a business exception in my try catch, so it would search that does business exception belongs to system.exception. So yes, it does, because that is the main class. System.exception is the main class, and all other type of exceptions are derived from system.exception. So it would execute this particular catch and would not go and check these two catch. So that's why the base class has to be always in the last. So if I just put this here and I put in index out of range exception here. Now if I get a business exception, it would check the first catch that whether this is business exception. It is not, so it would not execute this catch. Then it would check that whether this is business exception. So yes, it is, so it would execute this catch. Now if you get any other type of exception other than these two, so you like analyze that I would get only these three type of exception in my process or in my project, and you categorized it accordingly. But when in production the bot was running, you got another exception, which is an application exception, because your application was not up and running and you got that exception. So now what's going to happen, that it would check that application exception falls in here. So it does not. Does application exception falls in here? It does not. Does application exception falls in system.exception? Yes, it does. So it would execute this thing. So you always have to have a generic catch wherein if in future there is any exception which you did not forecasted, that would be taken care of if you have system.exception catch in your program. So it is always recommended that you have this catch of type system.exception and you have it at the last after all other categorization of the exception. Now if I want to categorize this thing here, and I'll have a business exception here, and from here I'll go to browse for types and I'll say business rule exception. You'll type BUSI and you'll get it. And I'll click on OK. Okay. So I am having my system exception above and business rule exception underneath it. So this is what you shouldn't be doing. You should always avoid doing this, because then your business rule exception would never be executed. And I'll show how it will not be executed. If I just copy it here and I'll say, okay, success. And I'll go to try catch, and from here I'll be throwing a business exception. I'll throw a business rule exception. Also, you have this local pane here wherein you can see everything. So we have exception details here. If you click on this magnifying glass, you will have a detailed exception. So you can see a remote exception wrapping uipart.core.business rule exception. Then you have this name try catch, which is where this particular exception was originated from. ID, instance ID, type name, and you have then all these information. And here you have the logging thing, which Nisarg told that there is a warning thing, then there is error, then there is information. I'll click step into and I'll come back to my debug workflow. So it has executed this business rule exception thing. Let me show an index out of range thing also. So I'll create an array. Let me name it ARR, and let's have a type of it to be string array. And we have ARR, give it new string, and let's define the size to be 3. Okay, let's see what's the error. Okay, yeah, so our error is gone now. And let's assign 2 values or just 1 value to it to see that index out of range exception. And at 0 we will assign ABC, and here with this particular demo we will also see how we can debug or what all options we have to debug. And we'll have ARR1 to be example, and let's remove this. Let's have a for each by which we can iterate and print each item of array. So we have for each item in ARR, which is our array. From here we need to change the type because our array is of type string. So we will have the type argument as string. Then we'll drag in a write line, and herein we'll have item. Okay. If I just go back to the slide, so the next thing which we have is a lot of options of how to debug: run file, debug, run, stop, step into, step out, step over, restart, retry, ignore, slow step, log activities, toggle breakpoint, show breakpoint panel, and open logs. So let's see it practically one by one, all the debugging options. So if I just click on this arrow, you have this run file, we have debug, and we have run. So we all know that there is a main file of every process. So if I just click on run project, so this entire thing would be triggered from the main file, or you can say from this file. If I debug, then this particular thing, the particular file which I have opened right now, would be put on debug from the starting activity or from the first activity. If I click on run file, then this current file, the try catch file which is currently open, would run. So these are the 3 things. Talking about stop thing, so that would only be enabled once I click on debug. So as I click on debug, I would get an stop activated. Along with that, we have a continue thing which also comes in picture when we put this thing into debug. So we'll see that now we have step into, we have step over, and we have step out. So for that, what we're going to do is, let's drag in a sequence here so that we see actually how the step into, step over, and step out works. And let us drag in 2 write lines here. And we say first write line and second write line. So with each iteration of our for loop, we have a sequence and we have a write line. Now when we do step into, so one by one sequentially each activity would be executed. If I go in step into, and also I think, so let me now go on to step into. So the first, I'll have the trigger on the first activity, that blue line. So I just got it. And I keep pressing on step into, and we have a shortcut for that. If you just hover onto any of the debugging options, you would get a shortcut key for that. So which is F11 for step into. So if I press step into, one by one, it would just keep on going into the activity. If I press step over, it would execute all the activities, but I would not have to, press onto each activity. If I press step over, so all the activity inside this container or this sequence on which I'm currently in would be executed, and I would get my control back in here. So that is how step over works. And step out will run all the activities in current container before pausing. So once we reach into for each loop, we'll see how that thing actually works. So when we were here and we were pressing step over, so when you press step over, what happens that this particular thing is not opened here. Like you see that everything is open and read only. So if I'm pressing step over here, the container would not just keep on opening. It would execute it and it would just return me the control. Now if I press step into, along with that, if you see you're in the locals pane, you can actually edit all these, wherein you get this pen sign. You can edit that value. Where you only get this magnifying glass, you cannot edit this value. So once I have my array in place, now I can change the value of array from here. So I have this null as of now. I have given ABC at 0 index and example at 1 index. Now when I'm debugging, I saw that there is a problem in my code and I want to debug it. I want to see what if I put a value here as the UiPath, would I get the correct answer? So there could be n number of scenarios like this wherein you'll have to debug that whether your program is actually behaving correct or not. And if it is not behaving, if I change this value of ABC to now BCD, will it now behave correctly? So this is how you actually do the debugging, that you can change the value here and then see that how now would the program behave. So I initialized it with ABC, but from the local pane, I changed the value to BCD and I clicked on OK. So now now you see that my array, if I click here, or okay, let me execute it. We got ABC only. It did not change the value. Let me try doing it again. It's not working for some reason. We'll see that why it's not working. So now I'm pressing step into, and you saw that this particular thing, this whole thing kept on opening here. That is, each activity is getting executed one by one. Now here, if I press step out, so what will happen now? It would execute everything. Nothing opened here like it opened previously. All the sequence went on, kept on opening here. It did not open, it executed and returned me the control to for each. So that's how step out behaves. If I click on restart, then everything would be restarted from the starting or from the first activity. If I click on restart, the control would go to the first line and it would restart everything. So you see here in the outputs pane that it has restarted everything. Now we have this slow step thing. So I'll try to, maximize this thing. So here you can see it's off written here. So there can be 4 speeds. It could be 1x, it could be 2x, it could be 3x, and it could be 4x. So 4x is the maximum speed. So if I click one time, it would be 1x. If I click 2 times, it would be 2x. By default, it is paused. But if you click on slow step, then you would actually be able to see everything working. So if I click on 2x and I click on continue, I could actually see the flow going to each activity one by one. So that is how this slow step thing work. And if I now click on break, wherever my control would be, it would be paused there. So my control was on second right line when I clicked on paused, and I got the control here. And now if I increase the slow step to 3x and I again click on continue, I would be able to see each activity getting executed, but at a more faster speed. And again, I can click on this thing to pause it, and I got the control here. And then we have breakpoint panel, wherein we can have show breakpoint and toggle breakpoint. So if I want to put a breakpoint here, so what breakpoint actually does, it would pause your control there wherever you put the breakpoint and then would wait for your next instruction. If I put a breakpoint here, I see this red line. And if I see show breakpoints panel, so I can see from here that on a right line in this particular file, I have a breakpoint. I can remove this thing from here only from breakpoints panel. I have to just select it and click on cancel or delete all breakpoints or enable all breakpoints or disable all breakpoints or just delete it. So now if I click on continue, my flow would come here to this right line and stop. If I click on continue, it did not stop because it did not reach there. It has already executed everything. If I click on debug, now my flow would come to that right line and stop for me, wherein I'll tell now that whether to step into or to step over or to do what. So it has stopped here. And it would not execute further until I click on continue or I click on stop or I'll have to do something, or otherwise my control would be stopped here. So if I click on continue, it would go on executing all other activities next to this right line. Then if there is any exception, then I have this ignore thing wherein my exception would be ignored. So if I drag in a right line here and I want to have sixth index of this array, which is not possible to be printed here. So I would get an exception here. And then we'll see how do we actually ignore an exception in case if we get any exception. Apart from that, we have this highlight element and we have this log activity. So these two can be toggled, but they have to be toggled before you actually start debugging. So log activities is nothing that if you log the activity, if you enable it, then you would have a detailed logging done on orchestrator or detailed logging sent to your orchestrator. So that's what log activity is used for. And you have to make sure that you toggle it or you enable it before you start debugging. Then if we click on open logs or we simply press Control plus L, so our logs would open here. So if I click on this thing, so that app data location which Nisarg showed, this is where your studio created logs are stored. So this is your logging of your studio and this is the logging of your execution. So if you open this, so everything which we were just executing, we were going on try catch, we were having error in code and we were having message box, everything. So that all is logged here. So you can see the log type, information, level trace, we have this process stopped log, then we have try catch, demo execution, ended, execution started, everything is getting logged here. Also, if you just disable this thing here, then what you're going to do is you would have a less number of logs being sent to your orchestrator. And if you enable it, then a more detailed log would be sent to your orchestrator. This picture in picture thing is for the attended automation, which is currently like it helps in attended automation. And when you will have a screen here, wherein the attended automation would keep on going and you would be able to do other tasks. So all this is also present on the academy course, which we told you to keep doing it in detail. It is even present there. You can go and check out from there also. So now let's see that how do we ignore the exception, or how do we click on this retry thing and what is the use of it. We know that this particular write line would throw an exception. And if I just click on debug this thing, and whenever we have that exception, we have that red line surrounded to that activity. So because we have clicked on the slow step thing, so we are getting each thing highlighted and we got an error here. So if we open this output thing, we get this index was outside the bounds of the array. Now we can either ignore this exception. When we ignore the exception, which means that keep on executing all other activities underneath this write line and just ignore this exception. Or if we want to retry, that suppose we were trying to click on a browser and there was an exception and I just want to re-execute it. Now the browser has loaded and I want to re-execute it. So I can click on retry. If I click on retry, it would retry, but it again throws the exception because index was outside the bounds of the array. If I click on ignore, it would ignore the exception and move ahead processing every other thing. So that is how this ignore thing could be used. In case while you are debugging, you just want to forget what exception came and you want to debug the remaining part of the code. So you can just ignore the exception in that case. So these all are the options which would help you in debugging, which is very important when you are working on a real-time project. So that's all from my side. If you have any questions, you can post it in the chat window. We still have 4 minutes left.
Is there any question? Please feel free to ask. If you have any question from previous session, or if you're finding any problem on Academy, you can ask that as well.
I think nobody has any question. Everything has been understood.
I think if you do not have any question, then we can wrap up the call. We are almost on time.
Yes, PPT
Yes,
will be sent.
it will be available on this event page only, Chinmaya. Okay, I think we are good. Thanks, Nisal. Thanks Anmol, and thanks everyone for joining the call. Wish you happy automation. See you again on 17th. I have already shared the link for the next session. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.